Programming for this week, titled Uncommon Ground, Communities Working Towards Solutions, is sponsored by Erie Insurance. For more than 90 years, Erie has been providing auto, home, business, and life insurance guided by the principles of the Golden Rule. Erie has more than 12,000 local agents dedicated to helping you choose insurance coverage that fits your life. To learn more, visit erieinsurance.com. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Ethel Paris and Theodore Elbert V. Lectureship. The V's children donated funds for the endowed lectureship, noting the importance Chautauqua played in their family life. Ethel and Theodore greatly appreciated education. Theodore graduated from Harvard Law School and served 4 years as assistant district attorney in Erie County, New York, eventually entering private law practice at the firm of Andrew, Sherwood, and V. Ethel was born and raised in Buffalo. She received a bachelor's degree from the University of Buffalo and a master's degree from Cornell University, eventually becoming a teacher at Bennett High School in Buffalo and Hamburg Central High School. The extended V family continues to be actively involved in the life of this institution. Please join me in thanking the V's for the remarkable legacy of support. This morning's lecture is the first of our 2019 Summer Assembly season designated as part of our annual Lincoln series in applied ethics. For the past 22 summers, Chautauqua has collaborated with the Lincoln family to explore contemporary issues in applied ethics. The Lincoln Ethics series is funded by an endowment established by David Lincoln in 2018 to embed permanently in Chautauqua programming that challenges us to confront the difficult ethical issues of our times. We're grateful to David, Joan, and Katie Lincoln for their deep and lasting investment in Chautauqua. Please join me in thanking them. Joining us this morning is Risa Goluoff, the 12th and first ever female dean of the University of Virginia Law School. Dean Goluboff is a nationally renowned legal historian whose scholarship and teaching focuses on American constitutional and civil rights law, and especially their historical development in the 20th century. After the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017, she led the university-wide committee charged with recovering from and responding to those events. She is the recipient of the University of Virginia's All-University Teaching Award and the law school's Carl McFarland Award for Excellence in Faculty Scholarship. In 2012, she was named a distinguished lecturer by the Organization of American Historians. And she went to a few decent schools. She holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard, law degree from Yale, and ever the underachiever, a master's and doctoral degree from Princeton. She also served as a Fulbright scholar to South Africa. On a personal note, I've had the great pleasure of visiting her on campus and seeing her remarkable school. You're in for an unbelievable treat. It's an honor to welcome her on her first ever visit to Chautauqua, and we're so pleased that her husband Richard and her children Aliana and Sally are able to accompany her. Her presentation this morning is titled After Charlottesville. Please join me in offering a warm Chautauqua welcome to Dean Risa Goluoff.
Thanks so much. Good morning. As Michael said, I'm from Charlottesville, Virginia. I moved there with my husband, Rich, in 2002 to join the faculty of the University of Virginia Law School, and he joined the faculty as well. I became dean 3 years ago, so we've spent the last 17 years raising our kids there and being Charlottesville residents. We're thrilled to be here. We're all here today for our first time. We've been having a wonderful time and so appreciate your warm welcome to your wonderful community. I'm not sure I would be standing here today if I weren't from Charlottesville. It's possible that Michael might have invited me to speak about the Constitution and the Supreme Court, or Brown versus Board of Education, or perhaps the 1960s and police power. Those are all things I know a lot about. But I was invited because I am from Charlottesville, and I was invited to talk about what happened there 2 years ago in August of 2017, as Michael said, when white supremacists and neo-Nazis chose our small city of around 50,000 people for their breakout rallies that led to the death of Heather Heyer, led to the injury of many others, and led to the emotional, collective and individual emotional injuries of so many more. Many of us have spent the past 2 years asking ourselves, what do you do in the face of such evil? And I personally have asked that question in a number of different capacities. As a Jew, a mother, a constitutional law scholar, a civil rights historian, the dean of a law school, a university leader, and a resident of the city of Charlottesville. For the first year, I was really deep in the weeds as the chair of the university's committee responding to those events. And for the second year, I've tried to take a step back and think about what those events mean and how we should think about them. So for the first part of my remarks today, I'm going to talk about the human and the institutional answers to that question. What do you do in the face of such evil? And then for the second part of my remarks, I'm going to put on my professorial hat, my constitutional law scholar, my civil rights historian hat, and talk about how do we think about that in an intellectual context, in historical and legal perspective. So what do you do in the face of evil? First, you mourn. You mourn the loss of life. You mourn the very real injuries. And you mourn the loss of a kind of innocence. Now, I'm no naive. I'm a civil rights historian. I know that even after 75 years of civil rights struggles, we are not an equal society. Inequality remains and racism remains. And I know that there are so many people in my town, in the country, around the world, who face vulnerability all the time for who they are, for who they're perceived to be, and they are not safe. But from my little perch, the world changed in August of 2017. My family had gone to Germany a few years earlier, and we had marveled with sadness at the fact that when we went to a synagogue in the city we were visiting, there was always a police officer outside, and they were afraid to wear Jewish garments when they were out in public. And we marveled at that. But after August of 2017, there's always security outside our synagogue. And I worry about my son wearing a Jewish camp t-shirt. This is not good if I'm already here and I'm only 2 minutes in. It'll get better. But it was a loss of innocence and a loss of security. And it's a loss that has only increased in the years since with Pittsburgh and with San Diego. And it was a closing up of the distance between our sense of ourselves as secure in a modern America as Jews and the vulnerabilities that Jews have faced here in other times and everywhere across the world. So first you mourn. You mourn for a lot. But then you celebrate. You celebrate the bravery and humanity of the people on that day. You celebrate the bravery of Susan Bro, Heather Heyer's inimitable mother, who carries on her legacy. You celebrate all the signs that showed up almost instantly overnight in every store window in Charlottesville and on every lawn in the city and the county, declaring that we choose love over hate and that those people are not us. And you celebrate all the people, the ones in my orbit. I celebrate my faculty members who served as medics and drove around the city of Charlottesville on August 12th. I celebrate the students who reached out to students they didn't even know to give them support. So, the faculty who were so active, the administrators who opened up their homes to students on the day of, and then all that there was to celebrate in the months and years after. The outpouring of energy and the rebuilding of community, not only the recovery but the response, the discussions and the town halls and the meetings and all of the ways in which people came together and supported one another was really a thing of beauty. So you mourn, and then you celebrate, and then you take stock. And you ask, how did we do? How did our institutions do? Did we respond as we needed to all the people in our community who felt themselves vulnerable and in need? In the most immediate sense, those were our Jewish neighbors and our African American ones. They were the most direct targets of what happened on August 11th and 12th, but they were not at all the only ones who felt vulnerable. The white supremacists and neo-Nazis who marched have a very narrow vision of who belongs in American society. It does not include Jews or Muslims or anyone of a religious faith other than Christian. It does not include LGBTQ Americans or those with disabilities, those who are anything but white, those who were not born in the United States, and for the most part, it doesn't include women. It is a muscular, violent, misogynistic, white, heterosexual, cisgender norm that denigrates and dehumanizes everyone that doesn't fit into that very narrow category. Now, in the immediate aftermath, we put this into larger contexts. We put it into the context of the growing and ever more violent anti-Semitism that has grown increasingly more violent in the years since. And we put it in the larger context that I'll talk more about a little later of the long history of slavery and segregation in Charlottesville and at the University of Virginia. So you mourn, you celebrate, you take stock, and you take action. And I want to talk about the actions we took both at the university and in the city of Charlottesville. As the chair of the committee at the university, I was really much closer to those, so I'm going to talk about those first, even though as a resident of Charlottesville, I was part of the efforts of the city and the Charlottesville community as well. So at the university, our committee understood ourselves to have three parts to our charge. The first one was the immediate safety and security of everyone in our community. And we wrote a report about how our institution did that day. And we took steps to increase immediate safety and security concerns. We changed policies. We added personnel. And then we moved on from the immediate and the safety and security. And the second part of our charge was recommitting to our values. Recommitting to values that were the opposite of the hate, the intolerance, and the violence that were on display on August 11th and 12th. Values of diversity, humanity, equality, tolerance, belonging. Those are our values as a university, and this was a moment where we said we must recommit to them. That will not be our future as these people would have it be. And third, we're not only a community as the University of Virginia. We are a community, but we are not only a community, we're also an intellectual community, a community of learning and scholarship and teaching. And so we asked ourselves, how do we put our resources, our significant intellectual resources, toward this problem? How do we change our institution? How do we self-examine and self-reflect and have the hard conversations to move forward? Which is exactly what we did. We had a commission that looked at how we present our history and our historic landscape. We made plans for increasing diversity among our students, our faculty, and our staff. We created millions of dollars in matching funds for new professorships in democracy and equity. We created and recreated and recommitted to our ongoing efforts to reckon with our own history of slavery and segregation. There had already been a President's Committee on the History of Slavery at the university that was renewed into a commission on the history of segregation at the university. And we broke ground that had been in the works for a while but became ever more significant on a new memorial to the enslaved laborers who had built the University of Virginia. I hope you all will come visit when it's finished, because it is really a remarkable and pioneering memorial. Of course, the work didn't end with the end of my committee after that first year, We have a new president, Jim Ryan, who is really continuing it in so many ways, and the university continues to take steps. We're funding bridging projects. We've established a living wage. We're doing so many more things, creating a democracy initiative, an equity center. At the law school, we have a new center, Karsh Center for Law and Democracy. Are these things everything one needs to do? No. Are they enough? Probably not. But they have made us a stronger, more just, more equitable, humane, and diverse university, and we will continue to build on that legacy in the years to come. The city of Charlottesville is doing much the same. And I say that, I hesitate, this transition is an awkward one, because the city of Charlottesville and the University of Virginia are not distinct entities. They are and they aren't. Our faiths, our history are completely intertwined, and a big part of the university's response is thinking about how to be a better neighbor. How should the university and the city of Charlottesville interact? How can we help Charlottesville in their recovery, and how can they help us in ours? But as a resident of Charlottesville, I want to talk also about what Charlottesville has been doing on its own. If you've ever been there, you know Charlottesville is a wonderful, wonderful place. And it is also, like so many places in the United States, and like the United States as a whole from its founding, a deeply stratified and unequal place. And in the aftermath of August 11th and 12th, the fissures, the divisions, and a lot of anger came to the fore. And it wasn't always pretty, and it hasn't always been easy. And sometimes civility has gone by the wayside. Civility can seem like a luxury good. Civility can seem like a privilege when you're talking about life and death, and only some people seem to have a platform to speak, seem to have the power from which to speak. And as the dean of a law school, I think reasoned dialogue is at the core of everything we do, and yet I understand the anger that underlies a lot of the incivility that we saw in Charlottesville. And despite how hard it's been, despite how raw and how obvious and how blatant the inequalities that persist have been, or maybe because of that, we have been hard at work. We have been using the justice system through cases to create greater equality and hold people accountable for what happened on August 11th and 12th. We have created a new civilian police review board. We have organizations like Resilience Seville. We have unity days and diversity days. We have a clergy collective. So many organizations, such an outpouring of plays and exhibits and books and community discussions of people committing to this place and committing to a future of this place that is more just, more equal, and more tolerant than it was in the past. Charlottesville is unique in this in some ways. We are mostly unique because we experienced what happened on August 11th and 12th, and that makes these problems far more urgent to us. But we are not unique in so many other ways. Like cities and towns across America, and especially university towns, we're struggling to make sure that everyone has housing security and to create more affordable housing. We're struggling with a wide achievement gap in education that we want to narrow. We are building our institutions. We are trying to make our town, our city, a more just and equal place. We are very much still in the midst of this as a community, as a city, in our governance, and in our goals. But I am so proud of all that we have done and all that we continue to do, because we are reckoning with our future, we are reckoning with our present, and we are reckoning with our past. As you may know, what began the white supremacists to come to Charlottesville in the first place was a controversy over some Confederate statues that are in the middle of Charlottesville city parks. And as we think about those statues, we should think not only about whether they should remain or not remain, but we have to think about what history isn't represented. And so a pilgrimage from the city of Charlottesville went to Montgomery to the Equal Justice Initiative, which is trying to create plaques in every place where there's been a lynching in the United States, one of which was outside of Charlottesville. So our community is really thinking about its past and about how to make sure that its future repudiates that past while not ignoring it and understands it so as to move forward. Now, I've been told that the key to public speaking is to talk in threes. That would have left us after mourn, celebrate, and take stock. Well, we have to talk about take action, and I'm about to go to number 5, which is take the long view. And I think, we're at Chautauqua. We don't stop at 3. You've got to think about take action, and you've got to think about the long view. So are you ready? Okay. So, because the long view is going to take some time. As I said, this is the second half. Okay, so the 5th part is take the long view, and this is my more professorial hat. We have to think about how to put this in a larger perspective. And I want to do that in 2 different perspectives, 2 different clusters of issues that are very much intertwined. One is about speech, and one is about equality. So speech. When the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis came to Charlottesville, they came in the guise of peaceful protesters. And violence ensued. And a lot of questions arose. Why were they allowed to come? Why were they allowed to speak? At what point did their peaceful protest turn into unlawful violence? Was it always unlawful, or did that happen after they began? We have had in this country, for at least the last 100 years, a judicially enforceable First Amendment that protects peaceful, nonviolent, free speech. And for about 100 years, the law is always changing, but there's been a fair amount of stability that people get to speak when they do so peacefully, within the bounds of certain limits on the time and the place and the manner in which they do so, but with no limits on the content. The government cannot pick and choose what speech to protect and what speech not to protect. And that means that if the Nazis and the white supremacists had come and not been violent, their speech would have been protected. And that is very disturbing to a lot of people. And this question about speech and violence and whether their speech should have been protected is, I think, in part, a large part, why Charlottesville resonated so much with so many so far from our little town. The question that I think that raises for us is, how do we think about a nation that is very diverse and has many different views of the world? How do we think about having dialogue across our differences? How do we countenance speech that we find not only disagreeable, but abhorrent and dehumanizing? And I think we're in a moment of real contestation about the answers to that question, and a moment of real generational tension about that conversation. And here I want to draw on my research in the 1960s, because whenever I think about these generational tensions, I think about the 1960s, which was another such moment, when the students engaged in mass civil disobedience and mass protests over issues that were not protected by the Constitution. And older generations said, "Why are you protesting this way? This isn't appropriate. Your tactics are not constitutional. Your goals are not constitutional. This is no way to behave." And I think we're in a similar moment now. And we see our young people asking, why is hate speech protected? And it's not enough just to answer them to say, it is. We have to grapple with the challenges that they're offering to the constitutional regime that many of my generation, and I'm sure many of you, think is the right constitutional regime. And I think part of our problem is that we are stuck in a false dichotomy between claims of freedom of speech on the one hand and freedom from harm on the other hand. And that false dichotomy is based on a caricature that free speech today is mostly exercised by those who are conservative, and not only conservative, but radically conservative and white supremacists, like those who came to Charlottesville in August of 2017. That is not the case. All free speakers are not conservative free speakers, and we would do well to remember that when free speech became constitutionally protected, it did so as a result mostly of those on the left: communists, anarchists, civil rights protesters, labor union organizers, Vietnam War protesters, and religious dissidents. Who the First Amendment protects changes over time, and it changes in any given moment. Sometimes it protects those who are more conservative, sometimes it protects those who are more progressive. But to our young people today, what they mostly see is police officers protecting the white supremacists and the progressive counter-protesters getting arrested because of their response to the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis, and they don't understand how this First Amendment is going to work for them. And I can say till I'm blue in the face, but look how it worked in the past, and I think it will work that way again in the future. Thus far, these are students I teach, they're not really buying it. And on the other side of this false dichotomy, the caricature is of young people, and mostly progressive people, who don't want to hear anything that they disagree with. And so there's a distrust of their tactics, of shutting down speakers, of demanding trigger warnings, and a distrust of their goals for the content of constitutional law, that it should think about the content of speech, and that hate speech should not be protected. But that caricature, too, is overdrawn. And it is not only our young people, and it is not only those on the left who don't want to hear speech that they don't agree with. So you might think about the controversy over kneeling before the American flag during football games. Whatever you think substantively about that controversy, you might think about the fact that it's also a claim not to have to be confronted with expression that makes one uncomfortable. That the owners and the viewers say, I don't want to see the way you feel about our flag. Or think about the fact that so many of us are able to curate the news that we get on a regular basis. We can choose to read and listen to news that agrees with our own perspective. And how far is the distance between saying, I only want to hear this, from I don't want to hear that, from you shouldn't say that, from I have a right for you not to be allowed to say that? That is not a very far distance, and that is of a same piece with the claims that these young people are making. So these are caricatures on both sides. And in fact, free speech, freedom of speech, and freedom from harm are not a dichotomy. So what I want to talk about for the next little bit is how do we get to freedom of speech? How do we overcome this false dichotomy? And I think that there are three preconditions to truly free speech among people in this country and among people in our own communities. The first one is to recognize the harms that speech can do. We say sticks and stones may break your bones, but speech can never harm me. That's not true. Speech harms. To say that speech harms doesn't mean that speech harms in a constitutionally cognizable way. It's not to say that if speech harms, then your speech, the speech of the white supremacists, shouldn't be protected. That's not what I'm saying. But just because the speech is constitutionally protected doesn't mean that it's not harmful. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't think about the ways in which it is harmful. And in particular, we have to think about how speech harms different people differently. So on August 11th and 12th, the anti-Semitism dehumanized me personally. It said I did not have a right to exist, and that affected me in one way. The anti-African American racist speech cut me to the core. It made me angry. It made me sad. I am an ally. I have spent my life thinking about, researching, and working towards civil rights for people of all races, but it did not dehumanize me in the same way because it wasn't about my humanity. And so we have to ask ourselves, how is it that speech hurts different people differently? And part of the claim that young people are making is, think about the harms. Now, we may disagree. I know I do. I am the dean of a law school. I am a constitutional law professor. I think we must protect all speech regardless of its content. We don't want the government choosing sides when it comes to speech. That said, we can't end the discussion there. We have to take these harms seriously and ask how they affect people. So that brings me to the second precondition. Not only do we have to think about these harms and how they differentially impact people, but we have to recognize that those differential impacts are systematic. They are not idiosyncratic. They are not individualized. They are systematic, and they have everything to do with equality and inequality. It is very difficult to have truly free speech when you don't have a truly equal society. People are not empowered to speak at the same level, and as a result, they hear speech and find opportunities for speech in very different ways. From the beginning of this nation, there has been a tension between our desire for liberty and our desire for equality. And that tension is implicit in these generational claims against free speech. We need to be thinking about how do we create greater equality so that we can have freer speech, so that we can listen to each other and speak to each other, knowing what the impact is likely to be, and actually be able to engage in real dialogue. So that brings me to the third precondition. And I know it's probably an odd structure that me, a law professor, the dean of a law school, I'm talking a lot about what is not legal and what is not constitutional, because these equality claims are not constitutionally cognizable either at the moment, and I think they shouldn't be, but I think we have to take them very, very seriously. So now I want to step even one step further out, and that is to say that when we speak, always and regularly, we are speaking within communities, and we are speaking within social contexts and norms, and we exercise our constitutional rights alongside so many other values all the time that I think we forget when we just want to say, but I have a right. Yes, you have a right. How do you want to exercise that right? In relation to whom? With what kind of language? In what community? And the example, the analogy that I think of here is the sandbox. We take our children to the public park, and they play in the sandbox. And our daughter brings with her a truck, and it's her truck. You bought her that truck. As a property right, she has full dominion over that truck. She can do whatever she wants to with that truck, and she can hold it over her head, and she can say, nanny, nanny, poo-poo, you can't play with my truck, right? It is her truck. Her legal rights, entire to the truck. And what do every one of us say to our children when they go in the sandbox? Share the truck. That's what we all say. It's not about a legal right. It's about how you behave as a human being. And isn't that all the more the case if my daughter were to walk into the sandbox with 10 trucks and find some kids there with none, right? We share, and we share from a place of humanity, generosity, empathy, and respect. Now, obviously, there is a world of difference between teaching children to share in the sandbox and figuring out how, as a nation, we can speak across differences as broad as anti-racist activists and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. But we have to start somewhere. And for me, that somewhere is my university and my law school. Universities are ideal places to begin this project. Our university is a place committed to learning, to open dialogue, to freedom of expression, to free speech. And it is also committed to the thriving of every member of our community and to our diversity and our belonging and our equality. And so we are a place to start as a community of learners together who can speak to one another across differences. And if that's true of a university, it's even more true of a law school, where what we do is reasoned persuasion. That is what we teach our students and what we do, and we have to be a model. Universities and law schools are not the only ones, and your community, Chautauqua, strikes me as clearly a place where we are ready, you are ready to engage in these conversations. You spend your vacations engaged in these conversations. No, it's an applause to you, really, not to me. And it's the 4th of July, and what better day to think about the tensions between liberty and equality and to recommit ourselves to our aspirations, to being the kind of community and then the kind of nation where we can actually have real dialogue across our differences. So equality and liberty are in tension, but they are also preconditions for one another. And freedom of speech and freedom from harm are deeply intertwined, and freedom from harm is a precondition. Freedom from harm that requires equality is a precondition for freedom of speech. So that brings me, I don't know how this works. That brings me, it's really fine. That brings me to the last piece. Thank you, Michael. Michael does everything, you know. He does everything. Sorry? Yes. So that brings me to the last long view that I want to take, which is about equality itself. Many people were surprised by what happened on August 11th and 12th. They were surprised by this resurgence of racism. Many were not. Most African Americans were not, because they know that racism exists and they know that inequality exists. But we tell stories about ourselves that makes us forget what racism looks like and what inequality looks like, and makes us forget that they do still very much persist. The story we like to tell about ourselves, which is partial and incomplete, as all stories are, is that once upon a time there was slavery, but then that ended. And then there was segregation, but that ended because of Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Movement. And then we had an African American president, and we entered into a post-racial era. And now we are all equal. We are all on a level playing field, and it is done. And that is where a lot of resentment comes from, the assumption that we are done. But we are not done. Slavery and segregation reached into every facet of American life. For 300 years of slavery and 100 years of segregation. Really, in a generation or two, it's all going to be uprooted? It is not. And it is especially not because our law, this was the subject of my first book, has failed to uproot all of it. But because that's the story we tell, our law has built on that story. And our law makes claims to colorblindness. We talk a lot about colorblindness, and it sounds like a great word, and it sounds like a great concept. But colorblindness is really problematic in a lot of ways. So when we think about, and when we talk about, we constitutional law scholars, when we talk about how should the Constitution create equality, there are two main paradigms that we use. And the first one is the colorblindness paradigm. It's a paradigm that we call the anti-discrimination paradigm. And what that paradigm says is that the government shouldn't separate people or distinguish between people or classify between people on the basis of race, ever. That the way to have equality is for the government never to think about race. And if you live in a society of no inequality, if you live in an equal society, then the government not thinking about race will lead to equality. That's the basis of affirmative action. Right? We're all on an equal playing, opposition to affirmative action. We're all on an equal playing field, and if the government were to prefer one race over another, it would be unleveling the playing field, and that would be problematic. The alternative paradigm is what we call an anti-subordination paradigm. And that paradigm says, well, if we live in a world of inequality, which I would say we still do, and if you look at any of the statistics, we still very much do, then for the government to remain neutral is for the government to allow that inequality to continue. And in order for us to get to a place of more equality, the government might in fact be required to take steps to end subordination and end inequality. So as I said, that's how we can think about the debates about affirmative action. Do you want the government not involved to leave the status quo, or should the government be involved so as to change the status quo? I think there's a similar narrative that goes on with critiques of Black Lives Matter. The critiques say, why are you elevating Black lives above all others? But if you take a recognition of the past and of the history when Black lives did not matter, then all Black Lives Matter is saying is, Black lives matter too. And we have to take account of the past in order to understand the present. Now, once we think about the story we like to tell, that we are now an equal society, and we think about the way the law has intervened and not intervened there, and how much more there still is to do, it's not only that the law has not done enough to end racial inequality, it's also that the law has inadvertently given new tools to the white supremacists. So the anti-discrimination paradigm says the government should not get involved in race, and that any kind of racial distinction that the government would make is the same as any other kind of a racial distinction. And you may have noticed, or maybe not, because I was paying probably a lot more attention than you were, that some of those who came to Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th called themselves white supremacists or white nationalists. But others called themselves white advocates. They said, we are white advocates fighting for white rights. And those terms are a direct, if unintended, consequence of this anti-discrimination paradigm. If the problem of race in America is a problem of talking about race, and there are people advocating for African American rights, why should there not be people advocating for white rights? White rights and white advocates are on an equal moral plane with those fighting for African American civil rights or the civil rights of other people of color. And that is a direct result of the anti-discrimination paradigm that we have been using for the past 40 or 50 years. Shortly after August 11th and 12th, we had an event at the law school, a panel discussion of experts. And one of them referred to the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis as, quote, an unpopular minority. And I was really struck by that phrase. And I had two different reactions to it. One actually was, I was gratified. Because in the 1950s and the 1940s and the 1960s, the periods I study, the white supremacists were the dominant majority. And the civil rights activists were the unpopular minority. And so I was gratified to think that that had flipped, and that in the days after August 2017, a unanimous bipartisan Congress condemned what happened in Charlottesville. So we had come a long, long way. At the same time, hearing them described as unpopular minorities made me afraid. Because as a historian, taking the long view, I know how unpopular minorities become dominant majorities, and it doesn't always go in one direction, and it doesn't always go in the direction you want it to. And it's up to us if we want to make sure that these events were a last gasp of that white supremacy, rather than a new upsurge and a new era of continuing and perhaps more vigorous and vitriolic white supremacy. It's up to all of us, and it's why so many people dissented in the days and years after August of 2017. So what do you do in the face of such evil? You mourn, you celebrate humanity, you take stock, take action, and take the long view. You commit yourself to the rule of law, you commit yourself to democracy and dialogue, to free speech in a community of equals, to humanity and empathy. You commit yourself to humor where you can find it, and you take all of the resources that you have, all of the education that you have, all of the resources you have, all of the institutions of which you are a part, and you put them to work to recommit to the values of love, tolerance, understanding, equality, and justice in the face of hate, intolerance, and violence. And you all here at Chautauqua already do that, I am sure, and you have a responsibility, because of who you are, the resources you have, your membership in this community, to go back to all of your communities and share that responsibility. And I have that responsibility in all of my roles. And it's a responsibility that I feel every day to say to the white supremacists and the neo-Nazis, you came to my city for a day, but I will resist you forever. And I will say, last year, after Pittsburgh, our synagogue had a morning service, and the clergy collective, this incredibly diverse, multiracial group of clergy who had stood on August 11th and 12th and protected the counter-protesters, they all came to our synagogue. And they sang a song that our rabbi had taught them about building a house of love and building a future of love. And it was sad, and it was beautiful. But just a few weeks ago, they came back to our synagogue because that rabbi had a baby. And we sang that song again, 7 months later, and it was beautiful. And it was more hopeful, and it was more optimistic, and it was literally a rebirth of love. So what I want you to take away more than anything is that when you think Charlottesville, when you think about the name of my hometown, and when you say it aloud, please never say it as a lament. please always, always say it as a rallying cry. Thank you.
Can't think of a better way to celebrate Independence Day. We know that some Chautauquans will be headed off to other programming. We ask that you do so quietly and respectfully so that we can continue the Q&A. As is our custom, ushers will be passing pieces of paper around for you to write questions. We also can receive questions using the hashtag CHQ2019, and you're welcome to do that as well. Just a personal note before I ask a question, small connection. Our board chair went to UVA Law School, and the first time I met the dean, she noted that others in our orbit had been invited, but she had not yet been invited. And then yesterday we saw one another and we were talking about this massive space and that you're discerning questioners, and I think there was a moment where she thought maybe I shouldn't have asked to be invited. But I can say unequivocally that we are profoundly grateful that you accepted the invitation to come.
Thank you. Me too.
Even when microphones and water bottles don't work the way we intended.
They're small things.
This is our first designated ethics lecture of the summer, and so I just want to lead with a question about ethics as we're collecting other questions. And I'm wondering, you did such a wonderful job of spanning humanity, law, and ethics. We talk often here about how to bridge the divide when you so vehemently disagree with someone and you rightfully expressed outrage. What's the ethical or legal dimension to talk to those that showed up as white supremacists, or how has your community been thinking about, or have you? Is there a point at which, from a different population's perspective, it's so hateful you don't engage? How do you engage with those that are just so at the polar opposite?
So I think that's a hard question, and I think there isn't a single answer to it, in part because speakers are so differently situated. And I guess I would tweak your question a little. I think that the reason why it's so hard for some to talk to white supremacists or to contemplate talking with white supremacists is not because the thoughts are polar opposite, but because the place they're starting from is a denigration of the very humanity of the people who might be talking with them. And it's really hard to have a conversation with someone who thinks you are lesser as a being. That's just a hard place to start. Now, that said, I don't think we're really going to make as much progress as we would like unless we can figure out where to start. And one of the things that I hadn't known all that much about before August 2017 is that there are organizations of former white supremacists, and they are trying to have those conversations. And I think that's a really good place to start, is with people who have been in that frame of mind and who now reject it. And I think they can be a real stepping stone and a real mediating force. I think it's a very hard thing to contemplate someone actually talking to someone who thinks you have no right to be in this country, you have no right to exist, you are inherently worse, stupider, dumber, not human than me. I think that's really hard. But I think if we can start to gain understanding by talking to those who have been there and moved on, we can then make maybe baby steps toward engaging with others. And I think, you know, the other thing I would add to that is when we do enter into those conversations, I think it's really important to ask questions and not only to speak. And that part of the goal in having real dialogue across our differences, however broad they might be, is not only how am I as a speaker, but how am I as a listener? And am I a generous and empathetic listener as well as a respectful and empathetic speaker? Justice Breyer came to the law school, and I think that's true. Justice Breyer came to the law school a year ago, and he spoke, and someone asked this question, how do we, talk past our differences? And his answer was very simple. He said, look in the mirror. First, look in the mirror and ask what assumptions you're making, and ask what you're thinking, and ask how you might be, threatening or challenging or saying things that are upsetting to other people. So you have to look inside as well as outside.
So a question that may delight you as a law school professor. So you've spent the morning talking about a very specific example that was physically site-based around issues of hatred and free speech. A question from Twitter saying, how do you think about that, or can you address the internet and free speech, including what Facebook and other similar sites would do when moments of inciting violence or hatred shows up in those platforms?
So it's obviously one of the biggest questions of the moment, and as a matter of constitutional law, Facebook is not a government actor. Facebook is not covered by the terms of the Constitution. The Constitution only covers government actors, which include the University of Virginia. We're a public university, but only covers government actors. And Facebook is a very, very, very large but private entity. So they are not governed by the First Amendment. They have free rein to do what they would like to do. And I think a lot of people would say, in the gap, and this is, I guess I would put this way, it's another example of where just relying on the law and relying on where constitutional rights and obligations are is simply not enough, right? To say Facebook has no constitutional obligations has, I think, led us to wait a very long time before asking, well, do they have other kinds of obligations, right? What kinds of obligations do they have for their users? Can they be regulated in other ways? And I think because we're often so focused on, well, they're not a constitutional actor, we can't do anything about that, we forget that there are other governmental tools, there are other regulatory tools, there are economic tools and consumer-based tools that people have at their disposal that they can use. And I think what we're seeing now is really a call to question what are these other tools and how can Facebook go about, and other organizations like Facebook, how do they take on their own corporate responsibility, and how does the government think about regulating them?
So a couple of questions that I'm going to combine, so I'll give you a question with an A and B.
Okay.
That drives to your current place or your current genre of employment, namely higher ed. And so one of the questioners says, I attended college in the 60s and 70s, and we didn't have a need for safe zones and or warnings about potential offensive terms or triggers. Why do you think those means are necessary now? And what does that say about students and our higher educational institutions? And as a follow-up to that, which may be even more...
That's not enough.
I know, right? I warned you that they asked really good questions here.
I'm not surprised.
And a follow-up to that, what would you do if you were Dean of Harvard Law in response to Professor Sullivan's actions as a defense attorney?
So for those of you who are not familiar, Professor Sullivan was a defense attorney for Harvey Weinstein, and he ended up being relieved of his duties as the head of one of the residential colleges there after student outcry. So I'll start with the first. I mean, I think that question really goes directly to what I'm talking about, and I think embedded in the question is really the kind of generational view that there isn't really a harm. And I'm really ambivalent about these questions. I think we have to expose our children and our students to things that make them uncomfortable. We have to expose them to hard discussions and hard issues. My children will tell you, I am always saying, we're raising adults, and they have to confront things in the world. And I feel that way about my students too. On the other hand, it is undeniably the case that an exam question with a sexual assault hypothetical is going to be more difficult for a sexual assault survivor to read and think through logically than a non-sexual assault survivor, right? That is simply a true statement. I'm not sure yet that we know what to do with that, right? But if our goal is to test our students' knowledge, that's going to interfere with our ability to test their knowledge, because it's not testing their knowledge, it's their response to the question. And I often think about, and I'm kind of inclined to write about, though I haven't yet gotten around to it, my day job as dean takes up more time than I have for scholarship, but I think that what we see in this younger generation is a kind of radical individualism and radical egalitarianism. So they get to choose what music they listen to all the time and what TV they watch and what news sources, and we're starting to get there, us older folks, but they are doing that all the time, always, and they are able to filter out that which is uncomfortable, that they don't like, and they are used to being able to curate everything in their lives. And when it comes to information, I think they want to do that too, and I think they can't. They have to be able to hear alternative arguments. They have to be able to make arguments against that. They have to confront them. But does that mean we should be insensitive to the ways in which speech, teaching, curriculum were maybe made for people, not them, or made without any cognizance that people might not be similarly situated to that information or those ways of teaching? I think we'd be putting our head in the sands if we think that. So I know that sounds a little wishy-washy, but I think it really is of a piece. We have to figure out ways to provide people communities that are comfortable, to make them feel that they have a full sense of belonging, to make them know that they can get upset, but then to figure out how do you get past that, and how do you make the arguments anyway, and how do you confront the things that are hard. I don't think simply by saying trigger warnings aren't a good idea, they're going to stop thinking, this is hard for me, and it's harder for me than it is for that guy, and that's not fair, because they're not wrong. So we have to take seriously those claims and figure out in a nuanced and subtle way how to answer them. As for Sullivan, we've talked about that, and I, as a leader of an institution of higher education, I am concerned at the demands that are placed on our institutions and on our leadership. And one of the other things that generational scholars, generational sociologists talk about the younger generation, millennials and Gen Z, is less of an institutional loyalty that they have, and that they are not loyal to institutions as a whole. They are asking, has the institution done what I want? Does the institution serve my goals? And there's a way in which that's incredibly positive and liberating, and maybe we shouldn't be as loyal to institutions as we are, but there's also a way in which that makes it really tricky to be an institution that, like my law school, my university, has many people of many different views, and especially lawyers defending clients who constitutionally have a right to defense, right? And you might not like the client or what they did, but I do think that we've got to figure out how to navigate this line between our students' expectations for what institutions can do and what institutions can do. And I say that at my peril, right? Because I am aware all the time of being buffeted by views on various sides of various political debates of how is my institution responding to all of these public moments. And it's a really challenging time for higher education.
An interesting question in particular on Independence Day, and admittedly I don't have the full context behind this Twitter question, so if the opening premise of it is incorrect, feel free to extrapolate on that. But what is Charlottesville's recent ending of their traditional celebration or acknowledgement of Thomas Jefferson's birthday? What do you think about that? Is that progress or is that a diversion?
It hasn't ended.
Okay.
Okay.
There you go. That's why I said I hadn't heard of that, but thought on the odd chance I had missed it. It was a salient question.
So it hasn't ended. It is still the case that we give out what are called Thomas Jefferson Foundation medals in 4 subjects. One of them is law in conjunction with Monticello. That said, I think underlying the question is how does the University of Virginia think about Thomas Jefferson as its founder? And I think that's a question that everyone at the university is thinking about. The president, Jim Ryan, talks about Jefferson's brilliance and his brutality. And I think we, as the legacy of the fruits of much of his labor, have to reckon with both his brilliance and his brutality, his amazing vision of equality and liberty for all in this country on July 4th, 1776, and yet his reality as a slaveholder who fathered children with one of his slaves. And we have to hold those two things in our head. And I will call out my son here for a second. When he was about 5, I said that my daughter was ambivalent about something. And he said, "What is ambivalent, Mommy?" And I said, "It's when you have two different thoughts about the same thing in your head at the same time." And we had recently been to Monticello, and he said, "Oh, like Jefferson." And I thought, yeah, that's right. So I think we have to reckon with him, but I think the brilliance and brutality we have to hold in our hands together and think about how to go forward.
So a question from our Mambo app about something that's been widely in the press these days, talking about the 3 co-equal branches of government and looking at what seems to be a tug-of-war between the 3, or among the 3 right now. Is there a mechanism, or do you see a way in which either the executive branch or the legislative branch can ignore a ruling by the Supreme Court, given that they're equal branches? I mean, and you've seen all the debates. Where do you think this goes?
So when I teach constitutional law and I go through the first 3 articles of the Constitution, Article 1, the legislative branch, is the longest and it's first. That was thought to be the most important branch at the time of the framing. Article 2, the executive branch, has a fair amount of detail and it's second. And Article 3 was the judiciary, and it was thought to be the weakest branch. And it has no power of the purse and it controls no army of its own, right? So the courts cannot enforce the rule of law on their own. And if you think back historically, post-Brown versus Board of Education, you think about Orville Faubus standing in the doorway in Arkansas of Little Rock Central High, and the troops came in. The troops came in before the Supreme Court issued its opinion denouncing Orville Faubus. The court wasn't going to do that until it knew that President Eisenhower was willing to back it up. So the courts have the power of persuasion, they make legal orders, but they are the weakest branch. And they cannot, on their own, enforce the law if actors in the other branches don't follow them, right? And there are many actors in the other branches. So you can imagine some actors not following them and other actors following them. But as a lawyer, as a law professor, I hope that the courts will continue to be a bulwark for the rule of law and for democracy. But I think that the only thing, and this is totally appropriate on July 4th, the only thing that can truly keep us moving forward toward our democracy, that can keep our institutions intact and the rule of law intact, is all of us. And we have to make our voices heard, and we have to say the rule of law is crucial.
People are just fascinated by the fact that you're within a university. There's just university questions coming left and right, partially, I think, because there's so much of this debate is playing out at universities. So a questioner is asking, as dean, how do you reconcile admission of a student who may be academically gifted, but who's demonstrated a history or profile of neo-Nazism or hate?
I don't think I've come across that hypothetical in reality. I will say that the question I suppose I would ask, I mean, we are content neutral. We have students, actually one of the things I'm really proudest of at the University of Virginia Law School is that we are one of the most politically diverse law schools, and we take that very seriously, and we're a very collegial place, and I think we are actually, I didn't want to put this in my original talk, but we're actually fairly uniquely situated because we are so ideologically and politically diverse, and we are so community-oriented that our differences don't balkanize us or divide us. They really enable us to have dialogue across difference, and we work really hard. It doesn't always work, but we work really hard to make that the case. And so we, as an admissions outfit, would not discriminate on anyone on the basis of their viewpoint. I guess the only question I have, and I suppose I should know the answer to this, but I don't, we don't accept students who are not going to be able to pass the character and fitness requirements of the bars that they will eventually need to be licensed in. And I don't know whether bar associations would not accept someone who professed neo-Nazi beliefs. So that would be, I wouldn't want to take their money and have them spend 3 years if at the end of the day they couldn't actually practice the profession they were coming into. But would it be a challenge for our community to have someone with such views? Yes. But I think we are content neutral in our admissions.
I've been asking you lots of rough questions, so I'm going to give you one of which you are eminently qualified, but is maybe less pointed. A couple of questioners are saying that our conversation this morning is bandying back and forth between the law and ethics. How would you describe the difference between the two?
Well, I mean, the theoretical definition of definitional basis of the law is rules backed by the force of the government, right? The law is a coercive force. I once was in a class where my first year of law school, the professor gave us this long article to read about law as literature and all these descriptions of the rhetoric and the literariness of law and all this stuff, and we took it really seriously, and we were talking about it for a long time, and then he started running around the classroom and saying, no, the law is not literature, the law is force, the law is coercion, right? So when we talk about law, we mean the 3 branches of government, and at some point, a police officer is going to come in your house and arrest you, right? Or you're going to get fined, or you're going to have to pay a tax, right? That there is force at some level of government to enforce what the law is, right? Ethics are beyond the law. Ethics are how we behave in moral ways toward one another all the time, every day. Now, there's not, depending on your view of the law, whether you're a positivist and you say, so long as all the procedures are filled, that is law, but you might actually think that the law can't be law unless it's ethically based, right? Unless it's underwritten by values. But that's a big debate among jurisprudents and among legal scholars. So certainly there is law and there is ethics, and for some, ethics would undergird law, and for others, it would be entirely separate.
And for others, it's just sharing the truck in the sandbox.
There you go, truck in the sandbox. At the very least, it's sharing the truck
Absolutely.
in the sandbox.
So a little bit more specific to your community and the thesis that you used this morning, how has your community responded and dealt with follow-up white supremacist rallies? How is the fact that this action continues impacting you, and what do you do about it?
So I'm happy to say that on the anniversary where we prepared heavily for the possibility of a repeat, there was not one. And I think that helped a lot with our healing, because it wasn't clear whether this was going to be an annual event or whether it happened once and then we would be able to move on. And I think, knock on wood, we feel fairly confident now that it's not going to move on. And I will say, and give a lot of credit to some lawyers who have brought cases that have really made it difficult for the white supremacists to come back and do violence. They still have free speech rights, but they can't come back with weapons in groups in the same way that they had initially, and I think that was a big reason why they didn't. That said, I think we are more empathetic toward other communities that are going through similar things, and I think we are more affected when they happen, because we know from personal experience what they look like. For my committee at the university, we put on the web most of the products of our work, and I know that other universities and cities and towns have used those as resources, and I've had lots of conversations with other universities about how we responded and how we would respond, both universities proactively thinking about what would happen if this were to happen on their campus, and also responding after the fact. So I think we feel it more deeply, we feel it more empathetically, and I think we're hopeful that the way we've responded and what we've done can actually be of some use to others going through similar things.
So you so wonderfully this morning talked about the ideal of a society being equitable and the acknowledgement that ours has not. How can we think about, how can we talk about the conversation around reparations, which is coming up in the presidential campaign now, without instantly running back into our boxes, which is where we find so much of the country? Is there a legal and or ethical way for us to unpack that? And how do you think about that from your perch as a legal scholar?
So I would say the first way I would unpack that is actually historically. So I think if you start talking about reparations and you have in your head this narrative that I talked about before, this oversimplified narrative that there was slavery and there was segregation and then it was over and now we're all equal, reparations is nonsensical, right? If we live in a world where we fixed all the problems, what do we need reparations for? And so I don't think you can start with the question of reparations. I think you have to start with the question of how far have we come and how far can we go? And I think we're never very good at remembering all of our histories, right? My first book is called The Lost Promise of Civil Rights. We forget as much as we remember, and the stories we tell erase other stories. And so I think the first step, whether you end up with reparations or not and what those reparations look like, I think the first step has to be understanding our history better so that we can start from the same starting point and think about where inequality still exists, why inequality still exists. That first book that I just mentioned, I really talk a lot about how before Brown versus Board of Education, people understood that Jim Crow was a system, yes, of separate schools and separate water fountains, of legal segregation and formal separation, but it was also a system of economic inequality, of material inequality, of exploitation. It was public and private, it was north and south, it was governmental and cultural and social. And on the road to Brown versus Board of Education, the lawyers decided to focus on the public, formal, legal segregation. And in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court justices then emphasized how important that piece was. And in doing so, they created an image of Jim Crow that was only that piece. And they created a jurisprudential framework that could only deal with that piece. And so when I look around the world today and I see continuing inequality, I don't think, well, we fixed it legally, but now there's this other stuff. I think, no, we fixed half of it legally, and there's this other half that we really still need to fix. But I think because we forget what that history looked like, we forget the full extent of slavery and Jim Crow, it's very hard in this moment to come to any unified or consensual idea of what it will take to go the next part of the way.
So it's always disappointing when our conversation ends because there's great questions in here, and I always promise the audience that I'll hand them to you, and I will indeed do that. We have time for one more that you may choose not to answer, but if you're wondering how...
Did you know that was an option?
Well, it's an option when it's 12 o'clock and the staff back there yells at me if I go to 12:01. True. But we'll end with this, and then I'll ask the audience at the conclusion of it to join me in thanking you. Are you available to be appointed to the Supreme Court, and can we let Washington know?
Thank you. That's very sweet. Thank you.